So officially welcome to this next in our series of NRS WIOA webinars, Unpacking the New and Changing NRS Standards. Today we will be talking about measurable skill gains. Before we get started on that though, as continuing in our path from last week, I would like to ask if anybody's got any questions about program entry and exit and periods of participation. But because we have a lot to cover in measurable skill gains, and I don't want to short us or keep us too long, I've got a timer. So we've got 5 minutes for questions on program entry and exit and periods of participation. Are you ready? We'll see if it actually loads and works. There we go. I know, fancy, right? I just added that this morning. So we'll hear a horn when our 5 minutes is up, or I can turn it off if we get done before that point. But does anybody have any questions about entry and exit and periods of participation? I know those periods of participation are a new concept for us, so I wanted to make sure that we could answer any questions that you may have thought of between last week and now. The timer also helps me practice my wait time.
Definitely. Do we want to touch base on the question that Jennifer posed, Becki?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Jennifer, did you want to articulate that question for us? Or do you want us to go ahead? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just wondering how much information we need to enter, if we can just enter what is on the front of the registration sheet and then, of course, the education piece, or if we have to actually put them in a class so they populate the classes and put the hour or whatever time they were in, if they were only in for an intake and haven't done any testing or anything.
Right, and Jennifer had actually emailed this question to Laura and I after the training last week, and I thought it was a great question. So Laura, thank you for reminding me of it. And I just told her what I have been doing is, you know, I do enter the information from the intake form once we have that intake completed, regardless of what else they have done. So if they have only the intake, they don't have an assessment, I just put the intake in and I stop there. If they complete an assessment, then I can go in and I can put those assessment results in, but that's all I do. And then once they actually enroll in and start classes, then I go in and enroll them into the class. And I have not been entering any hours until the point that they enroll because, and John, this is something that we might ask you to weigh in on, and I don't know if we need some guidance from Shannon as well, but as I understand it, unlinked hours in the LACES system are kind of a difficulty. Is that true?
Yes, more so in previous builds, I believe, than now. I know we had an issue with unlinked hours, and that if we didn't go in and make an explicit change, they could accrue 12, 20, 40 hours, and if they were still read as unlinked, they weren't considered countable hours, and then therefore these people weren't reporting. But I think they've since addressed that.
Oh, okay.
But if I understand, Jennifer was asking, Jennifer, you asked if you could just put minimal front page type of information into the database and leave them in a holding sort of intake / orientation class until they were deemed participants. Is that correct?
No, what I wanted to do is just enter the student demographic information and then not enroll them, not put them in any kind of class or put any kind of hours in until they actually came back after that initial meeting or that initial appointment. Because many of them haven't done anything more than the locator.
Mm.
So John, you know, like I said, I shared with Jennifer what I have been doing. Laura chimed in the same, but we wondered if maybe this is something we should refer to you and Shannon. There's our time.
Yes, I would like to think about these situations. Sure. And you know, out of all these trainings, and as we're putting together some issues and topics for our workforce training colleagues and WIOA partners, I think this should be, you know, and as we look at our assessment policy and any updates it may require to accommodate these changes, I think this should be one of, you know, a number of identified issues that we can provide some guidance and have a work group. You know, I don't want to dictate too much local policies, but I want to make sure we're meeting all of the, you know, federal compliance and NRS expectations. So, yeah, let's to be continued on that. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Good questions, though.
Yes, very good question. Thanks, Jennifer, for sharing that. All right, so then measurable skill gains. The easiest way for me to think about measurable skill gains is that they are kind of like educational functioning levels on steroids. They're like EFLs in our performance, but bigger and more. So that's what we're going to spend our time with today, is those measurable skill gains. And the good news associated with measurable skill gains is there are now more types of ways to get a gain for our participants. So there are actually, technically, under the legislation, 5 types of gain that we can use to measure progress towards academic, technical, or occupational credentials or employment. However, only 2 of those types of gain apply to adult education. The first is educational functioning level gain, which we think we're familiar with, but there are actually 3 ways now to document that EFL gain. And the second is the receipt of a secondary credential. So we have, again, multiple ways to show gains among our students. This is a handy-dandy federal chart that I actually rearranged a little bit because they had kind of spread the different colors out. The blue things, the blue boxes, are the types of measurable skill gain that Title II is able to demonstrate. So for us, we can do everything in blue. The orange boxes are the types of measurable skill gains that the other titles are also able to show. You will see there's passing technical and occupational knowledge-based exams is on there for the other titles and not Title II. There was apparently a great deal of discussion in the comment period regarding why Title II didn't have access to that one as well, but at this point still we do not. So it's a little bit of a sore point, I think, with some Title II programs that we don't have the ability to show measurable skill gain that way. But we do have multiple ways to show skill gains. So let's start first with educational functioning level gain. As I said, this is kind of like what we're used to, EFL gain. And you'll see one of the ways we can show EFL gain is pre and post test, which is what we have always done. We pre-test upon program entry, we post-test after an appropriate amount of instruction, and hopefully our students are evidencing gains in that pre to post-test period. But there are also a couple of other ways. If a student exits our program and enters some form of post-secondary education or training, even if they've not taken a post-test and made a gain on a post-test, they still get an educational functioning level gain. So if they leave our program and then enter some kind of post-secondary education or training, within 1 year, or I'm sorry, by the end of the program year, I misspoke, by the end of the program year, then they count for an EFL gain. The third way we show EFL is a little bit of a fake out for most of our programs in South Dakota. It's completion of Carnegie units. Those Carnegie units are used to award credits in a high school program. For those states that have adult high school programs, they can show EFL gain through completion of Carnegie units in an adult high school program. So EFL gain, really what most of our programs are focused on are the pre and post test, and then we have the bonus of counting program exit plus entry into post-secondary within that program year by June 30th of the program year. The second way we can show measurable skill gain then is through the receipt of a secondary diploma or credential. So if students get a GED or another high school equivalency degree during the program year, regardless of whether they've made a gain on a post test, regardless of what level they enter our program at and are at when they take those high school equivalency exams, as long as they complete that credential, they have made a measurable skill gain. So for those of you who are more text-based and a little less visual, here it is in words. An EFL gain can be measured by the following. You compare the participant's pre-test with the post-test, as long as you're using an approved test and approved testing measures. A participant can enroll in post-secondary education and training after they exit our program, but by the end of the program year, and then the awarding of those Carnegie units. Or the other way is if they complete their high school equivalency during their time with us, or within the program year. Questions about that? We're going to look at it one more way. And here are some additional keys in counting those measurable skill gains. All participants are included for measurable skill gain for each period of participation. So it does not depend on what level they are when they come in. It doesn't depend on their goals. There are no cohorts here. Anybody who enters our program is counted in the denominator of that measurable skill gain goal. You can only count one type of gain for each participant per period of participation, and the rule here is you take the last one achieved. So if someone comes into our program in October and they stay until the end of June and they gain 2 levels according to pre and post testing and they get their high school equivalency, that's only one measurable skill gain, even though they made 3 gains. Just how it works. Entry into post-secondary education is measured only after the participant exits. So we want to exit them from our program and then have them enter post-secondary. The receipt of that secondary credential and entry into the post-secondary education have to occur by the end of the program year, June 30th, in order to count measurable skill gain. So they have to get their high school equivalency, their GED or another high school equivalency, by the end of the program year on June 30th to count for a measurable skill gain. And if they exit our program and then enter post-secondary education, they have to make that entry into post-secondary education by the end of the program year to count for measurable skill gain.
We have a question for consideration here.
Sure.
This is Laura. So in terms of post-secondary education, and perhaps Becki or John, you'll have some ideas to weigh in on this. Would it be considered post-secondary education if we have an individual who holds documentation of a foreign high school diploma and is entering into a bridge type of program to prepare for college?
That is an excellent question. I do not know the answer.
So they have documentation of or receipt of approval to enter a bridge type of program?
Well, say an individual comes to our program to brush up their English skills, and upon exit of our program transfers to a college prep program, and that person has paperwork confirming that they have an international high school diploma, if not an international degree, but they're wanting to enter a college prep English program like a Bridges program. So upon exit from our program and entry into the next, would that be considered entry into post-secondary ed?
I think until the NRS implementation guidelines are published, we probably can't assert with full confidence, but I would certainly think so. You know, and related to that, what if an, you know, STI's ability to benefit program where someone is, Jennifer, if you want to speak to it, an individual who doesn't have a secondary diploma or high school equivalency is, you know, enrolled or matriculated into that program, contingent upon them earning a high school equivalency. What if, you know, the maybe stickier part of job training? I mean, what constitutes that language on the 2 slides prior?
And that's something, John, that I actually looked back at the TEAGL that we have, and it doesn't really expand on the definition of post-secondary education or training for the purpose of measurable skill gain. But I think this is one area as well where when Laura and I were at training, you know, one of the things that was mentioned was, so if they exit our program and then go into, you know, an employment training program where they get, again, one of those recognized national credentials or some type of credential, that would conceivably count as a training program, a post-secondary training program. Again, I think until the guidance comes out, we're a little bit kind of reaching in the dark for these things. But I would agree with you. I mean, certainly I think a Bridges program is considered part of that post-secondary institution's offerings, and I would err on the side of putting them into, you know, of counting that until we have something that says we can't.
And, you know, from a pragmatic or more procedural rather side, you know, they're only, would these individuals at STI or another public institution's student roster, would they be listed there and therefore gleaned on a national student clearinghouse data match, or are there, you know, implications that you have programmatically to follow up?
Yeah, that would be another good question
know,
to have an answer to.
And doing a lot of surveys, and then what kind of documentation, self-attestation will suffice, or what? So yeah, good.
Yeah. Very good questions. I wish I had a better answer for you. And then the last, we didn't look at the last one here, participants in adult high school, because that one really doesn't apply to us. Again, that's the Carnegie units, allowing them to move to 11th or 12th grade status according to whatever the state rule is. And again, most of us don't have that ability to look at the Carnegie units. I do think, as we think about how measurable skill gains count, though, one thing we need to think about is timing, certainly, because if we want to count that secondary credential, the high school equivalency, or the entry into post-secondary ed for a measurable skill gain, they have to occur before the end of the program year, by June 30th. So one question I posed at the national training, and apparently I'm far more about looking at for angles than other people are, because they all kind of looked at me funny, like, why would you even think about this? But what I was thinking, you know, think about the participant that I mentioned before. They join our program in October. They're a consistent presence in our program until the end of June. So they've got one period of participation, and maybe they make multiple gains according to post-tests, and they get their high school equivalency, you know, sometime in June. And they say, well, now I can go on and I can enroll in post-secondary school. Maybe they're going to Lake Area Tech. Maybe they're going to Mitchell Tech. So I know I've got a measurable skill gain for their current period of participation. And there's no way that they're going to get that post-secondary enrollment through before the end of June. But they might by September, especially if they've kind of started the process before they had that high school equivalency completed. So then is it in any way, is it in my best interest to continue to work with them on some of those career counseling activities that are completely allowable for Title II under the legislation, and to keep them around for at least 12 hours in July so that they can then exit my program in a new period of participation because it's a new fiscal year and get a measurable skill gain for enrolling in post-secondary education. So John, you're usually my voice of reason. Is that too manipulative?
No, I like it. I like it. And I don't even think it's much of a reach, because
I think
why wouldn't we want to assure college readiness and engage them in some way, or be working with Title I youth? Maybe they can help if this individual has financial need, or a whole host of other support services. So no, I think I'm glad you were so bold, and I don't think it's deviant or
good. Sometimes I can be a little deviant. The one thing we do have to keep in mind, though, is that for that post-secondary entry to count, they do have to have exited our program before that occurs. Now, that means that, if they're going to start school at the end of August, we can exit them on August 3rd, and they won't technically, again, officially be exited until we go 90 days without service. But once we hit that 90 days without service, that exit date will still be August 3rd. So I'm still okay if they don't start school until August 21st. The calendar is going to be our friend and foe, I think, as we make some of these adjustments. Okay, so let's look just at a kind of brief summary of what's new and what's not new. First, what's not new. We pre and post test, we always have. Our assessment procedures and policy remain essentially the same, and we are still encouraged and in fact required to follow those assessment procedures and policies that are in place. And what's new? EFL gain has been expanded. We have more ways to show an educational functioning level gain. And that includes that post-secondary entry after exit for all of our participants. That secondary diploma counts as a type of gain for any participant. They don't have to come in at a certain educational functioning level. They don't have to show another gain in level in any way. Somebody can come in at high intermediate, not make a gain on a post-test, but get their GED and count as a measurable skill gain, which in the past never happened. So that can work as an advantage test, because we know that sometimes that does occur. And then again, that entry into post-secondary and the receipt of the secondary diploma have to occur by the end of the program year in order to count for us as a measurable skill gain, and only one type of gain counts per period of participation. Questions?
We feel good, Beck.
Good, good. Then let's take a look at Table 4, because Table 4 is still where all of this stuff shows up as far as our accountability in reporting. And Table 4 still gives us participant numbers and rates of measurable skill gain, but it breaks it down now by educational functioning level and 4 periods of participation. So measurable skill gains are broken down into the EFL level gains and the secondary credential component. And it still provides that participant retention. It shows us the number separated and remaining broken down by EFL. So it provides performance data on MSG by type and by EFL level and by period of participation. And it allows us to examine that participant flow by entering EFL. We use the participants' EFL at their initial period of participation. So the first time they come into our program and they qualify as a participant, that's the row on table 4 that they will appear in for the entire program year. And we show pre and post testing gains, Carnegie units if we count them, and entering post-secondary education or training after exit in the EFL column on table 4. The high school equivalency gets its own column. So we record the number of obtaining their secondary credential. And again, that secondary credential attainment and post-secondary entry have to occur by the end of the program year. I'm hammering that one because I just want it to be very clear. Next week we're going to start talking about credential attainment, and I want you to be very clear about the difference there. We can only count 1 gain per participant per period of participation. And on the table that we're going to look at in just a second, again, like we talked about last week, columns B through H are unduplicated participant counts. And then columns I through K are duplicated counts. And we're going to report the number of periods of participation and the total number of outcomes per period and the EFL level. So let's take a look at table 4. And you can see, again, we've got the total number of students enrolled. We've got their educational functioning level that they enter at, the total attendance hours for participants, the number who achieve at least 1 educational functioning level gain. And again, column D, the EFL gain, includes both the pre and post testing and those people who enter post-secondary education or training after exit. That number is all encapsulated in column D. The next column, the number who attained a secondary school diploma or its equivalent, is separated out. But those both count as measurable skill gains. So as we work down the row, then the number separated before achieving a measurable skill gain, that counts everybody who separates before achieving any kind of gain. The number remaining in the program without a measurable skill gain in column G. And then you can see the percentage achieving measurable skill gains includes column D and column E combined. So our total number of students enrolled in ABE level 1 was 100. We had 38 people who either showed an EFL gain by pre and post test or by entry into post-secondary after exit. We had 12 people who got their high school equivalency degree. So that total is 50, and we have 50% achieving measurable skill gains in column H. Questions about that? Now, I'm going to again highlight our columns B through H because B through H show all the outcomes for the first period of participation for all of our participants. Outcomes for any subsequent period of participation are recorded in columns I through K. So whatever happens in the first period of participation shows up in these first columns B through H, and anything that happens after that, regardless if it's the second period of participation or the third, goes in columns I through K and will not show in columns B through H. Questions about that? So in this example, we had 10 additional periods of participation. We don't know how many people account for those 10 additional periods of participation at ABE level 1. And we had 2 more measurable skill gains in those subsequent periods of participation. Okay?
Becki?
Mm-hmm.
Under column E, echo, on secondary school diploma,
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading at the bottom of the table on my paper copy that column E is the number of participants who attained a secondary school diploma or its equivalent. There's no mention of when. So it can be while they're enrolled.
Yes.
Can it be any time in that program before the end of the program year?
That is my understanding, John.
So again, are we in this situation where if we have someone and they're just finishing, if they don't complete that last subtest before July 1st and they're gone, then potentially we can't count those early July earned high school equivalencies if we don't have
Yes, that is
hours?
true, unless we can capture 12 hours in the subsequent fiscal year, in the subsequent program year. That would still be the case. They did not talk about, you know, we used to have that grace period where if they finished in that, was it the whole first quarter?
Yeah, but it was up until December 31st until you submitted your annual reports for that prior program year.
That you could grandfather
right,
them
that you
in.
could count a GED or a high school equivalency. Okay, but let's say we got let's say we had 4 hours or fewer than 12, and so
Right.
they were a reportable, not participant.
Right.
And I don't want to get ahead of myself because I have one to table 4A, but one other question. What are the implications for corrections here if they earn it in the sequencing? Isn't there some language about if they're not released within X number of days?
I don't think that affects measurable skill gain. I think that affects credential attainment. Okay.
Well, how does that affect measurable skill gain as determined by credential attainment? Okay, so that you are right. You're correct. Table 5, report in column B.
Yeah, measurable skill gain doesn't affect Table 5 at all. And I wouldn't think that there would be any, I know there's not corrections exclusions for Table 4.
Okay.
Other than the ones that count for all of us, so.
Excluding Section 225 who exited the AFLA program but are still incarcerated. So, yeah. Attained post-secondary, attained a secondary school diploma, and then enrolled. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I know corrections is a wrinkle that I'm not all that great at just because they're so different than the rest of us. So again, just briefly, we have a column for secondary credentials. We have a column, or we have columns to record the number of periods of participation, the outcomes in those additional periods of participation, and the column that records more than one EFL gain that we had in the past, people who gained 2+ levels, is deleted because that doesn't matter anymore. We can only count one gain per period of participation. So I want to do a little bit of work around kind of semi-real people thinking about measurable skill gains. So we have Carmen. Carmen became a participant in September in ESL level 4. She attended until the class ended in November, and she achieved a level gain but then never returned. So this is a little review of last week. How many periods of participation does Carmen have?
1.
1. 1 period of participation, and that period would be reported in, it says column I, but that's not right. It would be in columns B through H. September to November, 1 period of participation. And how many measurable skill gains does Carmen have?
1.
1 again. Very good. Recorded in column D and in column J because everything pieces out to column J. Okay. Good. If anybody has questions about these as we're going, make sure you holler at me and I'll slow down a little. Tony enrolled in September but left after 10 hours. He returned in November but dropped out in December after 40 contact hours. He returned in April, post-tested in June, and showed a level gain and then exited that same month. So how many periods of participation does Tony have?
1.
Actually, he has 2. because he left in December and then he came back in April, so he's got that 90-day gap. So he has one period of participation that was September to December, and then a second one when he came back in April and stayed until June. That's his second period of participation. So he had 2 periods of participation. How many gains does Tony have? How many measurable skill gains does he have?
Just the one?
Just the one. So sadly, Tony's actually going to cut his performance in half because he's got 2 periods of participation but 1 measurable skill gain. So right off the bat, Tony has us at 50% for his level. And that's going to be reported in column J, his measurable skill gain, because it occurred in his second period of participation, not his first. So it won't show in columns B through H. It will only show in columns I through K, which is, it's weird. It's going to take some getting used to reading that table a little bit differently, I think. And one more example. We have Christopher, who became a participant in ABE Level 4 in October, achieved a gain, and then dropped out in December. He returned in April, passed the GED test in June to get his secondary credential, and exited. So how many periods of participation does Christopher have?
2.
2. September to December, again, and April to June. And how many measurable skill gains does he have?
2.
Also 2, because he got 1 in each of his periods of participation. He achieved an EFL and then dropped out in December, and then he passed his GED test to get his secondary credential before the end of June. So if we look at Christopher on table 4, here's what he might look like. He came in at ABE level 4, you'll remember. We're just looking at him. We've isolated him in the system, and we're looking at his attendance hours. He got at least 1 educational functioning level gain, where he gained that EFL in his first period of participation. He did not get a secondary school diploma or its equivalent in that period of time, though. He doesn't count as separating before completing or staying in because he actually gained that EFL, and he's at 100% in column H for his first period of participation. And then you'll notice in columns I through K, in column I, the total number of periods of participation is 2 because Christopher came back a second time after a 90-day gap. He did, however, have 2 measurable skill gains. So he made a skill gain in each of those periods of participation. So he stays at 100% in column K. Questions about that? I always think when you think about it in terms of students, it gets a little bit easier to understand how it works. And when you're thinking about following your own students through, it can get a little simpler, especially if you isolate people that you're looking at, you know, okay, so how did this person work in the system? It sometimes helps to see, if you look at one person at a time that way, kind of how table 4 plays out in different scenarios.
So, Becky, a couple questions. In looking at this student, I would see ABE level 4 and see that there are a couple of levels capable for gain. D delta, while likely it's a post-test, he could have left and entered some job training. I mean, theoretically.
Theoretically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then in column J, I would determine that he could have either made another EFL gain, earned that high school equivalency, or again left and entered job training or post-secondary ed, right? Those are,
exactly.
That's the maximum array of possibilities there.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay.
And I think it's very possible that for some of our students, especially I know in our Yankton program, Nikita just had a student who, he was with us not for 92 hours, but for only 1 period of participation, sadly. But he attained his secondary school diploma with us. He got his GED, so he would actually show not in column D, but in column E. And then he went on and she just emailed me last week, he got a very good job subsequent to completing his GED and exiting our program. But, you know, he could have just as easily, as you say, entered some post-secondary education. He only had one period of participation, so that wouldn't have shown anywhere. But, yeah, it's a whole different numbers game now, I think, and I think it's going to take a little bit of getting used to as we start looking. Once new Table 4 shows for us in LACES, it's going to take some practice understanding what we're looking at.
But Becki, if he was marked under column E Echo because of that high school diploma,
yeah.
If he were to enter post-secondary before June 30th of this year, you could count him in level or in column D as well.
No, because it's still all one
recent,
period of participation.
even though it's more recent.
What would happen then? Yeah, what would happen then? Yeah, he exited and entered post-secondary. So what would happen then is he would come out of column E and go into column D, theoretically. Again, I'm not 100% sure how that's going to work on the database end of things, but yeah, the most recent one is supposed to count.
So in terms of this and this other student you mentioned, there's no impetus to follow up with him for a measurable skill gain given the periods of participation, but maybe come Table 5 then, because he has that GED and is enrolled in post-secondary, then it's more of a Table 5
Exactly, exactly. We'll talk about him again next week.
All right.
Very good. There are a few implications as well just to think about for assessment when we talk about periods of participation in Table 4. We need to place our participants in appropriate educational functioning levels every time they come back for a new period of participation, and we need to be aware that their educational functioning level might change from the prior period on the basis of a new assessment, even though they will still always report based on the first EFL that they entered the program year in. They're not going to switch on the table from row to row. It's just that the way that we track a post-test gain will change based on the pre-test for each period of participation. So for example, if someone comes in at low intermediate in their first period of participation, that's the row they're going to populate for the entire program year on Table 4. But if they take a post-test and they end up being a high intermediate at that post-test, they get that skill gain. And then if they have a gap, we can use that high intermediate post-test for their next pre-test, and it's possible they will make another gain. Even though they're still showing on that low intermediate row, they have to make a gain up to low adult secondary in order to get that second skill gain. Was that horribly confusing? Perhaps.
It is. I think it's a bit confusing for me, especially until I can see it operationally in LACES.
Sure. Yeah, I'm very anxious for them to get. Yeah, I'm very anxious for them to get Table 4 up and out for us. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, right?
And what does it mean in terms of, you know, again, going back to the assessment policy and whether we need to revisit that and how much latitude we have with that? Because I don't want to over-assess, but at the same time, I don't want to lose any opportunities to recalibrate. And what does it mean if we initially had a pretest that was out of range? But you think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that those are legitimate questions, John, and I actually, yeah, I had some of those written down to discuss as well today. The assessments may carry over to new periods of participation if a student returns before that test has quote-unquote expired, and that's based on publishers' guidelines or the state assessment policy. And our retesting policy has to be based on sound assessment practices as always. So our assessment policy says that a student who has stopped out for 120 days or more should receive a new pretest. So that would mean that the test is expired according to our state policy. So if that is the case, that participant should be retested and there will be no carryover of assessments from the prior period of participation. The new period of participation is started using the results of the new assessment. And again, the EFL for the first period of participation is recorded in column B, but then their subsequent periods of participation are tracked using that new EFL. They just don't show on the tables that way. I think one of the implications of extending that 120-day rule would, it could eliminate the need for additional testing between periods of participation. I don't know. I don't know. I think that it's a pretty big gap for most of our students. I think many of them take a step backwards if they're gone for more than 120 days in between instructional times. And I can make a case either way for no, we should be reassessing them, or can we look at 150 days, or where's the magic number as far as that retesting period in our assessment policy.
Is there anyone willing to offer any local evidence, in terms of retesting in these situations? If we were looking to mitigate it, I would only be pre-testing on, hopefully I've got some information in terms of what subject I wanted and where the most need was. So why not just re-administer a single subject pre-test? I mean, would that be common practice, or do you think many of you would administer the whole battery again, particularly ABE, ASE, or and then Becki, is it that I can change my subject area
Definitely.
during this next
Yep,
new participation period?
You can certainly change the subject area that you're tracking in the second period of participation. That is completely legitimate. And in answer to your first question, John, if someone comes back, especially if they're close to that 120-day mark, we don't do the whole complete battery again. We look at either the lowest area, testing in the lowest area from their previous test again, or we have a conversation with them regarding what their goals are in relation to what they want to work on. And if they identify a subject area that's their real focus coming back in their second time, we would test in that subject area and not redo the entire complete battery at that time. I don't know what anybody else does, but I'd be interested to hear.
Thank you for sharing, Becki.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing that we need to think about is, if the test has not expired, they don't need to be retested. The EFL placement carries over from the prior period of participation. The next valid post-test you give is used to determine EFL gain in the new period of participation. But once that first period of participation is closed, any subsequent testing you do can't be retroactively applied to a closed period of participation once that exit is complete and the 91 days have occurred. The one exception that they gave us here is if someone comes in between, after 91 days for the express purpose of taking a post-test for you, then you can use that post-test to apply to that previous period of participation. They're not re-enrolling. They're not coming in for classes again. They're only coming in to do you a solid and take that post-test because you want a post-test to count for them. So for an example, if we've got a student, Joe, who spent 46 hours of study with us and he got a new job and his schedule doesn't allow him to come into our class anymore, but we contact Joe and we convince him, we would love to have you come in and take this one more assessment just to show how much you learned with us. And, if you do decide to come back, then you'll have a good idea of where you left off. So So it takes us a while to get him convinced, but eventually he does come into the office just to take that post-test for us. He's not re-enrolling. He's just taking that assessment. You can apply that assessment to that first period of participation, even if it's been 91 days and that period has closed.
Becki, what if it's been 100 days?
As long as you're still, as long as you're still okay and he's not re-enrolling. And you know, kind of the area that they talked about was, you know, beyond the 90, but still within that kind of testing window, which is another reason I think, you know, if we do see a lot of that, I don't know how much we'll see. We might want to think about extending beyond that 120 days. Because, yeah, it's kind of in that 91 to 120 day window where they'll think that that's kosher.
Oh, so it is related, or it is, I don't want to say correlated, but it's
kind of tangentially related to that 108 and 120 day policy.
The testing policy. I
Right.
can't just say anytime, if you come in expressly, you exit in December and have great success and come in prior to June 30th.
Right.
Solely
Well,
for,
unless
no,
that's how you want to write our policy. And I don't know if you specifically write a clause in for that, you know, that post-testing caveat in our policy. I don't know if that would fly or not. But yeah, the whole thing is they still wanted us to think about state policy when we're dealing with assessment, and periods of participation shouldn't change sound assessment practices is the main message there.
Can you say that one more time?
Periods of participation should not interfere with sound testing practices. Sound testing practices should still be our guide throughout our work with students, regardless of periods of participation. So they're saying, you know, don't fudge just because they came back in for a new period of participation. So. Okay, we're running out of time on this one. I was afraid we would. So just a couple of examples. Tony comes in September but leaves after 10 hours. He returns in November and drops out in December after 40 hours. So he was a participant at least that second time around. He returns in April and post-tests with a level gain in June when he exited. So if Tony, you know, Tony's pre-tested in September, his test can be reused in November because we're within that 120-day window for placement and reporting. But we're beyond, probably just beyond that 120-day period when he returns in April. So he would have to be retested for placement in April because our time set by state policy has expired. And again, probably just depending on the day in December and the day in April that Tony was assessed. Another example, Christopher became a participant in October. He got an EFL gain but dropped out in December, so we know he was post-tested in sometime between October and December. Again, he returns in April and passed the GED tests in June. If his test isn't expired, his post-test in December could be used for his placement in April. So again, depending on when in that 120 days, he might be out of range, he might not. But we're supposed to follow that state assessment policy. I want to quickly touch on Table 4B. 4B is the table that we use. It shows our number of participants who were both pre- and post-tested by level. And we use Table 4B to give us our post-testing rate, essentially. Table 4B has not changed at all. We still use a participant status at initial entry. Only participants who are pre- and post-tested show on Table 4B. It's an unduplicated count. And the first valid post-test after initial placement counts as a completed post-test on Table 4B. So post-tests can be from any period of participation. This is not a period of participation dependent table because they're unduplicated numbers. So they just need at least one post-test for some period of participation within the year in order to populate Table 4B. So the fact that they don't pre and post in each period of participation necessarily won't hurt your post-test rate based on Table 4B. Questions about that? And it says how to complete the table there. We're lucky. LACES completes the table for us, but this is how it does it. It's an unduplicated count, and any post-test will show up as a post-test on 4B. So no changes, the same as our original Table 4B on that one. Let's look at just a couple more examples, although you guys seem to have a decent handle on this. So if we have a participant with one period of participation who got a measurable skill gain, that same participant comes back for a second period of participation with an exit, but no measurable skill gain. Are both periods of participation recorded? And why or why not? Do both of those periods of participation count? I'll answer for you because it's late in the day. Yes, they do. And here's how it would look on your table. This participant came in at ESL level 3. So we've got one participant. They had 148 attendance hours. It tells us their first period of participation, they had a measurable skill gain. We're going to assume that was maybe a pre-post test for this ESL learner. So they're at 100% for us in that first period of participation. But then if you look at column I, they had a second period of participation. They're still showing on ESL level 3 because that was their initial level of entry. But that second period of participation shows up in column I, and you can see the total number of periods of participation with measurable skill gain stays at 1. So that drops our percentage of completion down to 50%.
Becki, in that situation, what if that student only returned for an hour
Then,
in the second period?
Yep, then you would have only one period of participation because in that second period they would be a reportable and not a participant. So then you would stop at column H. Column I would then be just one period of participation, one measurable skill gain, and you would stay at 100%. That's a very good question, John. One more quick example. Carlos enrolls in ABE Level 5 in September. He achieved an EFL gain, then left in November. He came back in January and exited in May, and then entered a post-secondary program. So what measurable skill gains does he have, and how many periods of participation, and where would these be reported? So Carlos enrolled in ABE Level 5 in September. So here he is on the ABE Level 5 row in column B as total number enrolled. We can see he got 86 hours, total attendance hours. He achieved an educational functioning level gain. We don't know if that was based on a pre-post test or if that was entering some kind of training program, but I'm going to assume maybe a pre-post test in this case. So again, he shows as 100% in his first period of participation for us over in column H. He leaves then, he comes back in January, exits in May, and enters a post-secondary program. So we've got him for 2 periods of participation and 100% skill gain as well. So again, just a review of what's, I'm sorry, yeah?
What if there were fewer than 90 days there?
You know what, there were fewer than 90 days there, weren't there? I messed that one up.
So is it one period of participation?
It would be just one period of participation and just one measurable skill gain. I don't know if I messed that one up or if I copied that right out of the federal worksheet. I'll have to go back and look at that. If they messed it up, I'll have to tell them. Good catch, John. That was just occurring to me as I was flipping the page on my notes. I don't think that's right. Sorry about that, guys. It's confusing enough. I don't have to make it more so. So again, just a quick review. There are multiple ways to show educational functioning level gain. A secondary diploma counts as a type of gain for anyone, regardless of what level they come in to the program at. They have to complete their entry into post-secondary education or training or their receipt of a secondary diploma by the end of the program year in order for it to count as a measurable skill gain. And you can only count one type of gain per period of participation. Pre and post testing to show gain is not new. Our assessment procedures remain the same unless the state policy changes. I will add that as a caveat. I want to just quickly, and I know we're at the end of our hour, but this won't take long, go over a few participant exclusions from the indicators. These are exclusions for these Table 4 indicators. So these reasons for exit allow the exclusion of a participant from all the performance indicators that we've talked about. If someone is incarcerated or enters into a 24-hour support facility like a hospital or a treatment center, then they are excluded from exit measures. I'm assuming that the system will allow us to show reason for exit that would create those exclusions. And they will just be wiped off of Table 4. If exit is due to medical treatment that lasts more than 90 days, if you have someone who becomes seriously ill and they need to leave the program due to their medical issues, then they are also excluded from performance. They're wiped off the table. If a participant is deceased, anybody who's had this happen knows it sucks, but it does eliminate that person from performance measures as well. And if their exit is due to being called into active duty in the National Guard or the other armed services for at least 90 days, then again, they are excluded from those performance measures. Any questions about that? We'll talk about that again next week too. Go ahead.
Is it safe to say that it has not yet been determined how this will be coded in LACES?
Not to the best of my knowledge. John, have you had conversations about any of the exclusions?
No.
I know.
We'll have to touch base with Shannon on that.
Yeah, I know that the Title I system, I've been around long enough that I used to actually kind of work in the Title I system as a Title II provider, and there they did have boxes that you could check that had some of these reasons in there that just excluded them from follow-up performance measures. So I would assume that they'll have to build in a way for us to show that one of these reasons is the reason for exit, and that will then remove them from those tables, or perhaps we'll just continue to mark them as exempt, as we have done in the past for people with extenuating circumstances.
But as I read this, this allows for that. So could there, in one of these situations due to incarceration or medical treatment, that individual has already made a measurable skills gain and we would not want to necessarily exclude them?
I think that's a possibility. I mean, I think that if someone has made a gain before one of these things happens, that it seems to me that they might be, but again, I can't say that with 100% certainty. So I think that that's perhaps a follow-up question for Shannon and perhaps as well.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Anybody have any other questions quickly before we go? If not, I will cut you loose and tell you to have a wonderful afternoon and a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Becki.